I still remember the way the light fell that afternoon. Soft, golden, like forgiveness itself. It was the day I learned that sometimes silence speaks louder than anger, and that love can be both a wound and a cure. When Genesis sent the wedding invitation to her father, the same man who once told her I'd never be good enough, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, maybe both. You see, I was never supposed to be part of her world, not with my second-hand clothes, my tiny apartment that smelled faintly of coffee and rain, my beat-up car that coughed every time I started it. Los Angeles was full of people chasing gold, and I was just another man trying to hold on to his dignity. But Genesis, she saw me before the world did. She saw through the noise, the difference in money, the expectations. Her eyes had this quiet way of saying, "You're enough," even when everything around us whispered the opposite. Her father, Mr. Jaxon, didn't whisper though. He said it straight to my face. In his penthouse office overlooking the city, with glass walls and leather chairs that probably cost more than my entire apartment, he looked at me the way a man looks at an insect that's crawled too close to his glass of wine. "You'll never be good enough for my daughter, Austin," he said, his voice steady, not cruel, just final, like he was stating a fact, not an opinion. That sentence burned a place in me that I couldn't forget. And even though Genesis never repeated it, I could see it in her eyes sometimes, the pain of loving someone her father refused to bless. When she mailed that invitation, not by email, not by courier, but by hand, she didn't write a note, didn't send an apology, just her name, my name, and a simple gold-trimmed card that said, "You are invited." That was all. And somehow, it felt like the loudest thing we'd ever said to him. Back then, I didn't know the story would twist the way it did, that there were things Genesis never told me, things her father did to test me. But I guess that's what makes love stories real. They're not about perfection. They're about what we survive together. And this is the story of how love almost broke me, and how silence, in the end, became my quiet revenge. I met Genesis on a Wednesday afternoon that smelled like rain and roasted coffee beans. I was 26, working part-time at a small bookstore near downtown Los Angeles. It wasn't much, the kind of place with dusty wooden shelves, old paperbacks, and a coffee machine that hissed more than it brewed. But it was quiet, and I liked quiet. She walked in wearing a white shirt and light blue jeans, simple clothes, but somehow they looked different on her. Not because they were expensive, but because she carried herself like someone who belonged to another rhythm of life. Calm, graceful, untouched by hurry. She was looking for a book, Letters to a Young Poet. I remember that because when she asked, her voice was so soft that I thought she was afraid of disturbing the peace of the store. I smiled and said, "You've got good taste." She smiled back, or maybe just too many thoughts to untangle. That was the first line she ever said to me, and somehow it stayed. We ended up talking for almost an hour, about poetry, loneliness, life in big cities, and the strange comfort of books that understood you better than people did. When she left, I found myself wishing she'd come back, and she did. Every Thursday for the next few months, she'd stop by after her art classes. Sometimes she'd buy a book, sometimes just sit near the window, sketching, while I stacked shelves. She said the smell of coffee and paper helped her think. I didn't tell her that her presence helped me breathe. One day she asked me why I worked there. I told her the truth. I'd dropped out of college after my mother passed away. Bills had piled up, and I took whatever jobs came my way. Delivery, warehouse, night shifts. The bookstore was the first job that made me feel human again. She listened without pity, and that made all the difference. Most people, when they hear you're poor, they either look away or start talking too softly, as if your life might break if they raised their voice. But Genesis didn't. She looked straight at me and said, "You've built yourself with your own hands." That's something my world can't teach. I didn't understand what she meant until I saw her world. It happened by accident. She invited me to her art exhibition, a charity event hosted in one of those glittering downtown halls filled with people who wore their money like perfume. I almost didn't go. My shoes were worn out, and the only jacket I had was too big. But she insisted, so I went. When I stepped inside, I realized I didn't belong there. The air itself felt expensive, soft music, crystal glasses, people smiling politely while scanning each other's watches. Then I saw her. Genesis was standing near a painting she'd made, a woman standing in the rain, holding a broken umbrella, but smiling anyway. It was beautiful, sad, and full of quiet strength, just like her. When she saw me, her eyes lit up. She introduced me to a few friends, but I could feel their confusion. I wasn't from their circle. I didn't talk the same way, didn't wear the same kind of confidence. And then came her father, Mr. Jaxon. He had that presence you could feel before he even spoke. Tall, silver hair, sharp eyes. He shook my hand firmly, too firmly, as if testing my grip. "So you're Austin," he said, looking at me like a man measuring something. "Yes, sir." "What do you do?" "I work at a bookstore," I said. "And sometimes I write." "Write what?" "Mostly short stories. About people." He smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, just the kind of smile that hides a thought you're not supposed to know. "Well, people are an endless subject," he said, then excused himself to talk to someone else. Genesis tried to smooth over the silence, but I could feel it, that invisible wall between her world and mine. Later that night, she apologized for him. "Don't," I told her gently. "He's just protecting you." She looked at me sadly. "Sometimes, protection feels like a cage, Austin." After that night, things slowly changed. We started meeting less often at the bookstore and more at quiet cafes, or by the beach after sunset when the city lights looked like fallen stars. She told me stories about her father, how he built his empire from scratch, how he valued control, discipline, and success above all else. I told her about my mother, how she taught me kindness is a kind of wealth too, one that never runs out. We came from different worlds, but somehow our broken pieces fit. And somewhere between the late-night drives and shared silences, love slipped in quietly like light through an open curtain. She said she loved how I listened. I said I loved how she saw beauty where others only saw profit. We didn't have much, but we had each other. And for a while, that felt like enough. Until it wasn't. The first sign came when I was invited to dinner at her family's house, or rather, mansion. It was the kind of place that didn't look real high ceilings, marble floors, a chandelier that glittered like 1,000 promises. Everything smelled of money and perfection. Genesis looked nervous that evening. She kept adjusting her bracelet, glancing toward the hallway. When her father entered, the air shifted. He greeted me politely, asked a few questions about my plans, my future, and my career path. His tone was calm, but I could hear the weight beneath it, a test I hadn't studied for. At one point he said, "You seem like a good man, Austin, but love doesn't pay bills, and dreams don't build homes." I nodded, unsure what to say. Genesis looked down at her plate. After dinner, he called me to his study. I'll never forget the smell of that room. Leather, old books, and faint cigar smoke. He stood by the window, looking at the city lights. "I admire your sincerity," he said. "But sincerity isn't a foundation for marriage. My daughter deserves stability, a life without struggle." "I'll work hard," I said quietly. "I'm already saving," he turned, his eyes sharp. "This isn't about saving, it's about belonging. She belongs to a world of expectation. And you, Austin, you belong to a world that apologizes for dreaming too big." I didn't answer. There was nothing I could say that would change his mind. When I left that night, Genesis followed me outside. She was crying. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "He can be harsh." I smiled weakly. He's just a father. But deep inside, I knew something had shifted. The seed of doubt had been planted not in me, but in the space between us. Still, we tried. We built memories, road trips in her old convertible, nights watching cheap movies, mornings spent laughing over burnt toast. But sometimes, when her phone rang and she saw her father's name, her smile would fade. I'd pretend not to notice, but I always did. Then one evening she said softly, "He wants me to take a break. From us, just for a while." I didn't ask her to choose. I just nodded and said, "Do what you need to do." She looked at me with eyes full of guilt. "You're too understanding." "I'm just afraid if I'm not," I whispered. "I'll lose you faster." We both laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. The days turned into weeks. I went back to my bookstore, to my quiet routines. I told myself she'd come back, because love always does in the stories I used to write. But love in real life doesn't follow stories. It gets lost. It hesitates. It breaks. And yet, one evening, just as the sun was melting into the horizon, she showed up again. No warning. No message. She walked into the bookstore, tears in her eyes, and said, "I told him no." I didn't need to ask what she meant. She had chosen me, against the odds, against her father's will. I held her close, my heart both terrified and grateful. We thought the hardest part was over, but the truth was, the story was only beginning. Because love, when tested by pride and power, always has a price. And soon, we'd both find out what that price was. For a while, after Genesis told her father no, life felt almost peaceful again. We found a small apartment near Echo Park, a single bedroom, thin walls, and a view of the city lights that looked prettier than it had any right to. The kitchen was small, but we cooked together every night. She painted, I wrote. Sometimes we'd sit on the floor with candles and talk about dreams. Hers were always full of color, mine full of hope. She said, "This is freedom," and I believed her. But freedom in our case came at a cost. Because freedom meant her father had stopped calling. At first, that felt like a relief. No pressure, no threats, no disapproving eyes. But over time, the silence became heavier than his words ever were. I could see it in Genesis, the quiet sadness behind her smiles. The way she'd linger on old family photos, or flinch every time her phone buzzed, hoping it was him. She missed her father, even if she didn't admit it. And I understood that. Because no matter how much a person hurts us, there's always a part of us that wants their love. One night I came home from work, exhausted but happy. I had written a short story that morning that got accepted into a small online magazine. It didn't pay much, but it was something. When I told Genesis, she hugged me, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "What's wrong?" I asked. She hesitated, then handed me an envelope. It was thick and white, embossed with gold letters. Jaxon Enterprises. I froze. I didn't open it, she said quickly. He sent it to my art studio. Probably another lecture in paper form. I nodded, though my stomach tightened. She placed it on the table, unopened, and for days it just sat there. A ghost in our home. When she finally opened it, she didn't say a word, just folded the paper back into the envelope and tucked it away in a drawer. I didn't ask, but that night, as we lay in bed, she whispered, "He offered to fund a gallery for me, said it's time I stop wasting my potential." "Wasting," I repeated softly. She sighed. "He means wasting it here. With you." Her voice broke on the last word, and I felt a quiet pain spread through my chest. After that, things began to shift, not suddenly, but slowly, like the way light fades when evening comes. She started working longer hours at the studio. Sometimes she'd come home after midnight, smelling like turpentine and rain. I'd wait up, pretending to read, pretending I wasn't worried. One evening, I asked, "Everything okay?" She nodded. "Yeah, just busy." But her eyes darted away, and I knew something had changed, something she wasn't ready to say aloud. One Sunday, I decided to surprise her. I went to the art studio with lunch and coffee. When I got there, I heard her laughter, that soft, familiar sound that used to belong to our evenings. But she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was Mr. Jaxon. He looked different this time, not like the cold man from our first meeting, but calm, collected, almost charming. He was complimenting her painting, the one of the woman in the rain. When he saw me, his smile didn't falter. "Ah, Austin. Good to see you." Genesis froze. "Dad, I told you it's all right," he said smoothly. "I just wanted to see her work. It's truly impressive." I nodded stiffly. "She's incredible." He glanced around the studio. "I can see that. She deserves the right audience." I felt the jab beneath those words, as if my love was a small, hidden thing keeping her from the world she belonged to. After he left, Genesis looked at me helplessly. He just showed up. "I didn't invite him." "I know," I said, and I did. But the image of them standing together stayed in my mind, father and daughter. Both beautiful, both confident, both belonging to a world I still couldn't enter. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to her breathing beside me, wondering if love was enough to hold two worlds together when everything else pulled them apart. Weeks turned into months. Genesis's work began to attract attention. A gallery downtown offered to display her paintings. I was proud, truly proud. She had worked so hard for it, but part of me feared what success might bring. At the opening night of her exhibition, the hall was filled again with those familiar faces, suits, champagne, cameras, the same world I had once walked into as an outsider. Genesis stood in the center, radiant and graceful. She belonged there now. When she introduced me to people, they smiled politely, but didn't ask questions. I was invisible, the man behind the artist, the shadow beside the light. Then I saw Mr. Jaxon arrive. He walked straight to her, kissed her forehead, and whispered something that made her smile. When he turned toward me, our eyes met. He came closer, extending his hand. "You must be proud," he said. "I am," I replied. "She's extraordinary," he continued. "Reminds me of her mother. You know, Austin, I might have misjudged you. You've been steady." "I respect that." His words sounded kind, but his eyes were measuring me again, same as before. "I appreciate that," I said quietly. He smiled. "In fact, I'd like to offer you something. My company is looking for a writer to handle a few internal campaigns. Decent pay, good experience. You could use the opportunity." It was polite, generous even, but I knew what it really was, a test wrapped as kindness. I said, "That's very kind of you, sir, but I'd rather build something of my own." His smile faded just a little. "Of course, pride is expensive though. Don't let it cost you happiness." And then he walked away. That night, on the drive home, Genesis was quiet. Finally, she said, "He was trying to help Austin." "I know." "Then why did you turn him down?" I took a breath. Because it wasn't help. It was pity. She looked out the window, silent. We didn't argue, but something in her silence felt colder than words could ever be. After that, we began to drift slowly, gently, like two boats tied to different anchors. She became busier. I became quieter. Sometimes I'd find her lost in thought, staring at her phone. Other times, she'd come home from dinner meetings that I wasn't invited to. When I asked about them, she'd smile and say, "Networking, Austin. You wouldn't enjoy it." She was right, I wouldn't. But what hurt wasn't that she went. It was that she didn't think I belonged there. Then came the night everything broke. She came home late again. It was raining outside. Her hair was wet, her hands shaking slightly. "What happened?" I asked. She dropped her bag, sank onto the couch, and whispered, "He said he'd disown me." My heart stopped. "Your father." She nodded, tears spilling. "He said, if I marry you, I'll lose everything. My inheritance, my studio, my name." He even talked to the gallery owner about withdrawing support. I sat beside her, unsure what to say. I told him, "I don't care," she continued. "But he said, I'll care when the bills come, when life gets harder, when you can't give me what I need." Her words weren't cruel. They were terrified. I took her hands. "Genesis, I may not have his money, but I have love. Real love." She looked at me with so much sadness that it scared me. Sometimes, love feels like the only thing I have left to lose. I held her. We didn't speak again that night, but I knew something in her faith was beginning to fade. In the following days, the silence between us grew heavier. She started spending nights at her old house just to talk things through. I pretended not to mind, though my heart did. One morning I found her suitcase half-packed. She said it was just for a short stay. But when I hugged her goodbye, she didn't promise she'd be back soon. That night, I walked into our empty apartment and sat beside the candle she had left on the table, the one she used to paint by. Its flame flickered weakly, just like us. Days passed. Then weeks. She didn't return my calls. I tried not to chase, tried to respect her space, but every hour felt like waiting for rain in a drought. One evening, I saw her on the news, standing beside her father at a charity event, smiling for cameras. My chest tightened, but then I noticed something. She wasn't happy. Her smile was practiced, her eyes dim, and that gave me a strange kind of comfort, because it meant she still remembered me. A few days later, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, Mr. Jaxon was standing there. He looked calm, composed, wearing the same confidence that once filled entire rooms. "Austin," he said, "we need to talk." He didn't wait for an invitation, just stepped in, looked around, and nodded slightly. Simple, clean. "You've done well for yourself." I stayed silent. He turned to me. "You love her." "I see that, but love is selfish when it keeps someone from growing. You'll both suffer for it." "Is that what you told her?" I asked quietly. He looked at me for a long time, then said, "She's fragile, Austin. She needs stability. You're good-hearted, but good hearts don't pay rent." "She's not fragile," I said. "She's brave. She chose me." He smiled faintly. "Not anymore." Something inside me cracked. "What do you mean?" He handed me a white envelope. Inside was a note, her handwriting. It said, "I need time. Please don't look for me. And beneath that, a pressed flower, the same one I had given her on our first date. I closed my eyes. Mr. Jaxon put a hand on my shoulder. "You'll thank me one day." Then he left. I don't remember much of the next few weeks. Just quiet, the kind that eats away at everything. I stopped writing. I stopped sleeping. Every corner of that apartment reminded me of her laugh, her sketches, the way she'd hum while making coffee. But even through the ache, I couldn't hate her. Because deep down, I knew she was fighting her own war. One I couldn't see. And I didn't know then that her silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. Because love, when it's true, never disappears. It just waits quietly, patiently, for the moment it can finally speak again. And Genesis was about to speak louder than anyone expected. Months passed, enough time for the pain to stop being sharp and start becoming a quiet ache I carried everywhere. I went back to the bookstore, though I couldn't look at the corner where she used to sit. I wrote again, but my stories felt empty, like houses without light. And still, every night before sleeping, I whispered her name in my heart, as if maybe she could hear it somewhere. Sometimes, I'd imagine her standing by her father's window, looking down at the city, wondering if I was okay. She was. I wasn't. One evening, as the sun was setting behind the buildings, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something in me, that small, stubborn hope, pressed accept. The voice on the other end was shaky, soft. "Austin." My heart stopped. "Genesis." There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing. Then she whispered, "Can we meet?" I didn't ask where. I just said yes. We met at a small park near the edge of the city, the one where we used to watch the sunset when everything was still easy. When I saw her walking toward me, I almost didn't recognize her. She looked thinner, her eyes tired, her smile faint but real. "Hi," she said quietly. "Hi." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was full of everything we didn't say. She finally looked up. "I'm sorry for disappearing." I nodded. "I guessed your father had something to do with it," she sighed. "He did, but not in the way you think." I waited. She sat on the bench and took a deep breath. "He told me something about you." My chest tightened. "What did he say?" "That you were lying," she whispered. "That you were using me for money." I laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because it hurt too much not to. "And you believed him?" Tears filled her eyes. "He showed me proof, Austin. Bank statements, messages, things I didn't understand." I frowned. "Messages?" "He said you were talking to a woman from his office, that she was helping you get a job, but you were asking for money from her. He said, you planned to use me to climb." I stared at her, stunned. "That's not true." "I know," she said quickly. "I know now. But back then, I didn't know what to think. Everything was happening so fast." I leaned back, my hands trembling. "So he set me up." She nodded slowly. "Yes, I didn't see it then. But now I know. The woman works for him. She told me everything last week." I sat there, silent, trying to process it all. Mr. Jaxon hadn't just doubted me. He had tested me, manipulated both of us just to prove I wasn't worthy. But then Genesis said something that changed everything. "He didn't do it because he hates you, Austin. He did it because he's scared." I turned to her, confused. She looked down at her hands. "My mother died when I was 12. Dad loved her more than he's ever loved anyone. But she got sick, and the doctors couldn't save her. He couldn't save her. Since then, he's been terrified of losing anything, especially me." Her voice cracked. "He thinks control is protection, that if he chooses everything for me, I'll never be hurt." I closed my eyes, suddenly understanding more than I wanted to. "He's wrong," I whispered. "I know," she said softly, "but it's the only way he knows how to love." The silence between us felt heavier than before. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. It was crumpled, like it had been carried around for weeks. "I wrote this after I left you," she said. "I was going to mail it, but I couldn't." She handed it to me. Inside was a letter, her handwriting shaky but clear. It said, "I wish I could tell you I'm strong enough to fight everyone, Austin. But right now, I'm fighting myself. I still love you, but I don't know how to hold that love without breaking my father's heart. Maybe one day, he'll see you the way I do. Until then, please forgive me for being silent." I read it twice before speaking. You were never the one who needed forgiveness. She smiled weakly. Maybe we both did. We sat there for hours to people who had loved and lost and still didn't know how to stop caring. When she finally stood, she said something I'll never forget. "I'm going to marry you, Austin." I froze. She looked at me with quiet certainty. "Not now, not tomorrow, but soon. Because I'm done letting fear decide for me." I shook my head, overwhelmed. "He'll never allow it." Her eyes softened. "Then he doesn't have to come. But I'll still send him the invitation." After that night, things began to change again, slowly, but with purpose. Genesis moved out of her father's house. She found a small studio apartment downtown. She started painting again raw, honest art full of color and pain. Her work began to attract even more attention, but this time she refused every offer that came with her father's influence. We saw each other in secret at first, like two fugitives hiding from the world, but there was peace in it, in being together without permission. Sometimes we'd drive to the hills at night and just sit there in silence, watching the city lights. I'd rest my head on the steering wheel, and she'd trace constellations in the sky. One night, she whispered, "Do you still believe in happy endings?" I smiled faintly. "I believe in honest ones." She leaned her head on my shoulder. "Then we'll write one." But Mr. Jaxon wasn't done. A week later, he showed up at my workplace, the bookstore. The air changed the moment he walked in. His tailored suit looked out of place among dusty shelves and flickering lights. "Austin," he said, his voice calm but cold, "we need to talk." I nodded, motioning toward the small back room. He didn't waste time. "You saw her?" "Yes, I warned you once," he said quietly. "You're ruining her future." I took a deep breath. "She's building her own future now. You can't protect her forever." He looked at me, really looked, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that wasn't anger. It was fear. "You think I don't know what happens when love fails?" he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I lost my wife to sickness because I couldn't give her the life she deserved. I won't watch my daughter go through that with you." I swallowed hard. "With respect, sir, love didn't kill your wife. Life did. And no amount of money would have changed that." He closed his eyes for a moment. "You sound just like her." We stood there in silence for a long time. Then he said, quietly, "If you really love her, prove it. Walk away." I didn't answer, because for a moment, I almost considered it. Maybe he was right. Maybe Genesis would be safer without me, richer, more stable, less judged. But then I remembered the way she looked when she said, "I'm done letting fear decide for me." And I realized love isn't about walking away to make things easier. It's about staying, even when the world tells you not to. So I said softly, "No, not this time." He looked stunned, as if no one had ever refused him before. Then he turned and left, saying only one thing before walking out. "You'll regret this." But I didn't, because a month later, Genesis and I stood in a small church at the edge of town, just us, a few close friends, and soft music playing from an old speaker. She wore a simple white dress she'd designed herself. I wore a suit I borrowed from a friend, and when she walked down that aisle, smiling through her tears, I knew I didn't need anything else in this world. When the ceremony ended, she pulled a small golden envelope from her bag, the wedding invitation she had written weeks before. She handed it to me. "Will you post it for me?" she asked softly. "To your father?" She nodded. "He deserves to know. Not because he agrees, but because I forgive him." Her voice trembled. "He's been trying to control love his whole life. Maybe this will teach him he never could." I held her hand and whispered, "He'll hate me." She smiled faintly. "Then let him hate you until he learns to love me enough to stop." 3 days later, she sent it, a single golden card addressed in her handwriting. No message, no apology, just our names and the words, "You are invited." She didn't know if he'd come, neither did I, but on the morning of the wedding, as we stood beneath the sunlight pouring through the old church windows, a black car stopped outside. Mr. Jaxon stepped out, not dressed for celebration, but for surrender. He didn't speak to anyone. He just stood there in the back, silent, watching his daughter say her vows. When she looked toward him during the ceremony, tears filled his eyes. And when we said, "I do," he quietly turned and walked away. He didn't stay for photos. He didn't speak to me. But later, when we returned home, we found something waiting at the door, a single white envelope with no name. Inside was a check and a note that said, "Don't ever think I approve. but take care of her the way I couldn't take care of her mother. There was no signature, but I didn't need one. I tore the check in half and kept only the note, because that was worth more than anything he could have given. That night, as Genesis slept beside me, her hand resting on my chest, I looked at her and whispered, "We made it." And for the first time in a long time, my heart felt still. Not because everything was perfect, but because it was real. It's been a year since our wedding. A year since that quiet morning when we promised to love each other, even if the world didn't clap for us. And somehow, we kept that promise. Life didn't suddenly turn magical after that day. We didn't wake up rich or famous, but there was peace in our small home, laughter in our kitchen, and love in every corner of our lives. The kind of love that doesn't shout, it just stays. I still remember our first few months as husband and wife. We rented a small one-bedroom apartment near the bookstore. The walls were thin, and the water heater barely worked. But to us, it was a palace. Genesis filled it with her art, paintings of skies, of hands reaching for each other, of light breaking through storm clouds. She'd sit on the floor, brush in hand, humming softly while the morning light touched her hair. And me, I wrote again. Stories about love that doesn't quit, about poor men who believed they could be enough. Stories that didn't end with castles, but with hearts that finally rested. We didn't have much money, but every evening when she leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "I'm home," I felt like the richest man alive. But even in happiness, there were ghosts. Mr. Jaxon hadn't spoken to Genesis since the wedding. He didn't call, didn't write, didn't even send word through anyone. At first, she pretended she didn't care. She'd say things like, "He'll come around someday," or "He needs time." But sometimes, late at night, I'd find her staring at her phone, scrolling through old pictures, her father holding her as a child, her mother smiling beside them. She'd look up and whisper, "I just wish he could see I'm okay." I didn't know how to answer, because I wished the same thing. Then one morning something changed. I was sweeping the bookstore when an envelope slipped through the door. It was white, elegant, the kind of paper only someone like Mr. Jaxon would use. Inside was a letter. Short, cold, but full of unspoken weight. "I'd like to see you both. 1 hour. My office. Tomorrow." I stared at it for a long time. When I showed it to Genesis, her hands trembled. "Do you think he's ready to talk?" I shrugged. There's only one way to find out. The next morning, we went. His office was exactly how I remembered it. Glass, marble, silence. But this time, when he saw us walk in hand, something in his face softened. He stood, slowly, and for a moment he just looked at Genesis. "You look happy," he said quietly. She nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "I am," he turned to me. "And you?" "I'm trying," I said. He nodded again, as if that answer made sense to him. Then, to my surprise, he gestured for us to sit. "I won't lie," he began. "I was angry, furious. Not because you married him, Genesis, but because you reminded me how powerless love can make a man feel." His eyes glistened. "Your mother made me feel that way too. And when I lost her, I swore I'd never let love control me again. But watching you walk away, I realized I'd been trying to protect you from the one thing that made your mother happiest. Freedom." He took a deep breath, his voice shaking. "And I'm sorry. To both of you." For a long time, Genesis didn't move. Then she stood and walked to him, slow, hesitant, like a child approaching an old wound. She placed her hands on his shoulders. "I never stopped loving you, Dad. I just needed to live my own story." He looked at her, eyes red, and whispered, "You sound just like your mother." She smiled softly. "That's the best thing you've ever said to me." After that day, something gentle began to grow again. Not a perfect relationship, but a bridge rebuilt stone by stone. Mr. Jaxon started visiting us once a week. At first, he'd sit stiffly in our little apartment, clearly uncomfortable with our simple life. But then, slowly, he began to change. He'd bring groceries instead of gifts. He'd help Genesis hang her paintings. He even bought a few of my short stories when they got published in small magazines anonymously. Of course, but I knew it was him. One evening, he stayed for dinner. Genesis made her favorite pasta, and I poured him a glass of wine. As we ate, he said quietly, "I thought love was about control. But watching you two, I realize It's about faith." He looked at me and added, "And I owe you thanks, Austin. You gave her something I never could." I smiled. "What's that?" He hesitated, then said softly, "Peace." Life moved forward. Seasons changed. Genesis's art gained quiet recognition. Her paintings were displayed in small galleries across Los Angeles. Critics called her work emotionally raw, but I knew it was simply her heart on canvas. One painting, though, became special. It was called The Window. It showed a girl standing inside a dark room, light pouring through an open window, and outside a man waiting beneath the sun. When I asked her what it meant, she said, "It's the moment I decided to stop hiding." That painting sold for a huge amount, enough to pay off our debts and open our own art and book cafe in the city. We called it Chapter and Canvas. The cafe became our shared dream, a place where stories met colors, where love had a quiet home. She painted the walls. I filled the shelves. Sometimes she'd hold art classes for children, while I read poetry to whoever would listen. People came not for coffee, but for calm, for the feeling that they belonged somewhere safe. One afternoon, as I was closing up, I saw Mr. Jaxon sitting by the window, sipping coffee and watching Genesis paint a mural. He looked peaceful. When I sat beside him, he didn't speak for a long time. Then he said softly, "I used to think wealth meant control. Now I see it means responsibility to lift others, not chain them." He turned to me and smiled faintly. "You were right about life, Austin. Love didn't destroy me. My fear did." I nodded. "Fear destroys more than failure ever could." He chuckled quietly. "You sound like someone who writes too much." We both laughed. And for the first time, we weren't enemies. We were family. A few months later, Genesis found out she was pregnant. When we told Mr. Jaxon, he went silent, then walked over and hugged her, tears running down his face. "I'll try to do better this time," he whispered. To love without fear. That was all she ever needed to hear. The night our daughter was born, the hospital lights glowed soft and golden. Genesis held her in her arms, tiny, perfect, wrapped in white. When I looked at them, I thought about everything we had gone through, every tear, every doubt, every fight. And I realized something simple but true. Love is not about winning. It's about staying. It's about forgiving. It's about showing up again and again, even when the world doesn't make it easy. We named her Hope because that's what we had been running on all along. Hope kept us together when fear tried to tear us apart. Hope made a billionaire kneel and a poor man rise. Hope turned heartbreak into healing. And now, Hope had a face, small, warm, and breathing in Genesis's arms. Years later, when Chapter and Canvas became a well-loved place in the city, people often asked me, "What's your secret? How did you two make it work?" And I always smiled and said, "We stopped chasing a perfect life. We just chose each other again and again." Sometimes Mr. Jaxon would visit with his granddaughter. He'd sit in the corner reading one of my books while Hope painted beside her mother. And every time I saw him there, surrounded by color, laughter, and light, I thought, this is what forgiveness can build. Now, as I tell you this story, the cafe is quiet. The sun is setting behind the glass, painting everything gold. Genesis is cleaning brushes. Hope is sleeping in the back room. And I'm here, writing not to tell a story of revenge or triumph, but of redemption. Because sometimes, the sweetest revenge isn't proving someone wrong. It's proving love right. I was the poor man who loved the billionaire's daughter. The world said it would end in heartbreak. But instead, it ended in peace. And that, I think, is the real miracle of love. Years have passed since that golden morning when Genesis and I promised forever. The bookstore is gone now, replaced by Chapter and Canvas, our little world of stories and colors. The cafe hums softly in the mornings, the smell of coffee and paint mingling like old friends. People come, linger, and leave with a piece of peace they didn't know they were missing. And every time I look at it, I remember how small we started to people. Poor in money, but rich in hope, fighting against the weight of fear and pride. Genesis is sitting by the window, her hands stained with paint, her hair glowing in the late afternoon sun. Hope is asleep on the couch, tucked under a tiny blanket we embroidered ourselves. I watch them both and feel a quiet pride I've never felt before. Not the kind that comes from money or power. Not the kind that makes people bow or take notice. But the kind that makes a heart so full it could burst from love, from trust, from life lived honestly. I often think about Mr. Jaxon. He's still in our lives, though differently now. No longer the controlling, proud man I once feared. He's learning slowly, painfully, but surely that love cannot be controlled. That wealth cannot measure the worth of a person. That fear is only a shadow, and it disappears in the light of faith and forgiveness. And in those moments when he watches Genesis paint or reads one of my stories aloud to Hope, I see something I never thought I would. Not broken, but softened. Not defeated, but understanding. Sometimes I close my eyes and remember the nights of silence, the ones when she disappeared, when letters went unopened, when the weight of his expectations pressed down on us. The nights when I wondered if love could survive against walls built by fear and pride. And now I smile, because love did survive. Love endured. Love changed everything. Genesis comes over and squeezes my hand. "You're thinking again," she says, teasing. "I am, I admit." "You always do," she laughs softly. I look at her, at the lines that tell our story. The hands that built a life beside mine, the eyes that saw me when no one else did. "Do you ever regret it?" I ask quietly. She shakes her head. "Not for a second. Even with him, even with everything, it was worth it. Every tear, every fight, every lonely night. Because we found each other?" And she's right. Hope stirs in her sleep, stretching tiny arms toward the sunlight. I bend down, brushing her hair from her face, and whisper, "You are loved, more than you'll ever know." And in that moment, I realize that love isn't a story that ends in triumph or tragedy. It's a quiet, enduring force. It's patience, forgiveness, and courage all woven together in the smallest gestures. The simplest promises, the gentle, unspoken trust between hearts. When the day winds down, and the city outside glows like a sea of fireflies, Genesis and I sit together in silence. I take her hand in mine, feeling the warmth of everything we've survived, everything we've built. And I think, finally, the truth we learned is simple but powerful. In the end, wealth can't measure the worth of love. Pride cannot protect what the heart truly desires. Fear can try to control, but it will always fail against courage and honesty. We survived not because the world gave us a path, but because we chose it together. And that's a kind of forever that no one can ever take away. I look at Genesis, at Hope, and at the little world we made from nothing. I smile, whispering softly to the quiet air, "We made it. We really made it." And for the first time, I feel completely, utterly home.